Hello guys, and welcome to our front-end web development course. In this CSS class, we are going to be talking about CSS specificity. My name is Damilare from Rice Academy. Okay, so what is CSS specificity? As we all know, there are multiple ways to select an HTML element in CSS. For example, we are going to be considering this paragraph element on the left side of my screen. You'd see this paragraph has an ID of findBoy, and it belongs to a class called parent. We can change this class to all paragraphs, all paras. Now, and it's also a P element. Now, to select this P element, we could use the ID, and the ID here would be what? findBoy. We could also use the class. The class here would be all paras. We could also get his state, let's say it's overstate, using a pseudo class, and we could also still reference this particular element in CSS using its attribute. Let's assume it's an input. Let me also have one input here. Sorry. Let me bring this up. Let me have this input here. The attribute here is type, which is number. And what that simply means is I could use this attribute to also select it in CSS. Now, specificity is saying that if I have multiple styles that are pointing to a particular element, how does the browser know which particular style to apply to that element? For example, let us style this paragraph tag using the ID. So we'll go to our CSS file and we'll do a pound symbol. What's the ID here? findBoy. Open and closing curly brace. Let's give the background color of black. And a color of white. Let's save. As you can see, can you see this? Please look at the preview here. The moment we gave this paragraph this style of background color black and color white using its ID, we got the response we wanted, or the style we wanted. We could also have styled it using its class. Remember, when you want to start using a class, you use the dots selector. So we'll come here. Let me hide this for now. We have dots all paras. That means any element that belongs to this class, all paras, would have the style we want to put in these curly braces. So we'll come again, we say background color. This time around we say green, but we still say color white. Now we have styled it using the class name. Let's go ahead and style this guy using the elements to which it belongs. That is the P element. So we'll come here. It does not have pound symbol. It does not have dot. Just P. P. And then we say background color red and color white. Now, we have been able to style this guy, this element with its content, in 3 different ways. Using the ID, using the class, and using the element name. We could also decide to style this particular element, take notes please, directly in the opening tag. You remember we spoke about the opening tag, that it can take in several attributes, ID, class, and there are global attributes that the paragraph or every HTML element can take in. One of such global attributes is the style attributes. You can style an HTML directly in its opening tag without styling it in the CSS. When you do that, you're going to have something like this: background color purple, and then background color purple, and then you're going to have color to be white. Now you can see that we now also have the style inline. This would be the basis for our CSS specificity class. Let me remove the inline style and then we start our class fully. Now, to know which style your browser is going to pick, you need to use this formula. And this formula just simply tells us the weight or the number that is appropriated to each kind of styling that you do. If your styling is inline, by default, the browser gives that style a weight of 1000. So that means your inline style will always win, even if you have other styles within your CSS file. As long as their combination is not up to 1000, an inline style will be acknowledged and others will be discarded. If you start with the ID, for example, this particular one here, your browser is going to give it a weight of 100. And what that means is, if there is no inline style and in your CSS file you have ID, your browser will give it a weight or a score of 100. And if there are other styles that don't have that weight, the ID style will be acknowledged. Let's move ahead. If it is a class selector that you used, like .all params, a class, a pseudo class, or an attribute selector, your browser is going to give it a score of 10. So if there is no other style that has a score up to 10, it will respect that particular style and reflect it in the browser. If you use the element selector in this particular instance, that is the P element, your browser is going to give it a score of 1. And what that simply means is, if there is no other style that has a score that is higher than this one, your browser is going to respect that style and is going to reflect it in the browser. Now, let's assume that we have these 3 styles in our CSS style sheet. You might be asking me, why would we have 3 styles? Because different people are working on these projects, for example, and developer A already wrote a style for that particular element in your CSS style sheet, and for whatever reason, you do not have access to that particular selector in the style sheet. You might want to write your own selector to pick up that particular element. As such, your browser will do a calculation and look for the one with the higher weight or higher score and then reflect it in the view of the browser. So now, look at this. We have FineBoy targeting this particular element. We have .all params class targeting this particular element. We have the P element targeting this particular element. These 3 selectors for just one element. Which one is our browser going to respect? Who can answer that question for me? It's going to respect the FineBoy selector. If we are change this to brown. Now, it discarded the .all params, it discarded the P, and it picked FineBoy. Why? Because an ID selector already has a score of 100, while class has a score of 10, element has a score of 1. Looking at this, you realize that the ID selector has the highest score, and that is why your browser picked it up. If your ID were not to be a part of the selectors, you only have your class and your paragraph, what happens? It picks up the class selector as the next style to use. Why? Because if you look to your right, your class or pseudo class or attribute selector have a score or carry a weight of 10. If your all params, if your class is not in the CSS style sheet, then it picks up the element selector. Is that clear? Now, let's make it a bit complex. You remember your 1,000, 100, tens, and units in mathematics? Hold on. Let me just do that again. 1,000, 100, tens, and units. Now, let's make it more complex. Let's look at this now. I'm trying to look for a way to make it complex for you to understand. Let's move this paragraph tag inside a div element so that we increase the specificity. Okay. Now, let's say we are looking for a div, a paragraph element. You remember in our former class where we talked about CSS selectors, we are looking for a paragraph element that is a descendant of a div element, right? And then it has an ID of findBoy, and that particular paragraph element, you see that I have my ID without a space because I'm trying to define that paragraph element by its attributes. And then it also belongs to a class of all dash paras. Now let's calculate the specificity of this guy. Just to select this guy, we use the div that is his parent. We use its element. We used its ID. Then we use its class. Now let's pick it one by one. Because we used what's it called? The div, which is an element, to select it or to reference it. We already have in our 10,000 100 tensor units. We already have. You remember that if you go to your the previous page. Hold on. We agree that the element selector carries a score of 1. So div here, can you see this div here? Would carry a score of 1. The paragraph itself will carry another score of 1, right? Because we also selected it using an ID. Remember, if you go back, ID selector carries a weight of 100. We'll come here, 100. We also selected using class, and our class selector carries a weight or score of what? 10. We come back here, we had 10. When we had all of this together, we are going to have 2, right? 1, 1, 2. The specificity score for this particular selector here is 112. As you can see, your VS Code would also help you to define it. Can you see? Selector specificity is what? 112. And what that simply means is, even if you now use an ID as also a selector, it will no longer pick the ID, because now this guy here has a higher specificity than the findBoy ID. Now let's look at this first of all. Let's change this to yellow. Yellow, and the color is black. So I save. Now, even when I uncomment this selector for the ID, my browser will overlook this particular instruction and come here and respond likewise. Do you know why? Because this guy here has a higher specificity than the other one on top, which is the ID selector. So let's look at this. Nothing changes. I keep changing this blue. The browser keeps respecting this and ignoring the one on top, because now this guy has a higher specificity. Let me go back the specificity scores again. Inline is 1000, ID is 100, class is 10, element or pseudo elements. You know pseudo elements in our previous class, like colon, colon before, colon, colon after, and a whole lot of other elements, pseudo element selectors like content for class, pseudo class like over, like required, and the likes, attributes like href, and every other attribute you could have in an element. They all carry a score, selector score of 10. This carries a selector score of 1. That's for elements. Okay. So now that we already have this, even though we have tried to select this element using all the selectors available, if we define the style inline, that is in the opening tag, see what happens. Let me comment this and then uncomment this and move it inside the div. Now it's picking the style in the opening tag. Why? Because by default an inline style has a specificity score of 1000. So irrespective of what you have written here, all you still have is 112 and this guy is 1000. That is a whole lot more than what you have in your CSS style sheets. So your browser would ignore all these instructions, styling instructions, and just pick the style available in your opening tag. Yeah, one last thing I would like to talk about briefly is the order of selectors. We've talked about our inline styles, we've talked about our ID, we've talked about our class. So you know your pseudo class 2 would have over and the likes, elements, pseudo elements. Then if we now have two selectors with the same specificity score, which one will the browser pick? Let's quickly check that. Once again, I hide the inline style since it would most likely have a very high score and we might not be able to override it. Let's assume that I have this guy that has a specificity of 112. I also have this guy that has a specificity of 112. And I change this to red. What happens? It picks the last one. Now, this has a specificity of 112. This has a specificity of 112. And the browser believes that if they have the same specificity, for you to have repeated it one more time, probably you are the last person working on it. And this is what you want. So if I move this up and I save, it will pick blue because now this is the last style. So if your CSS selectors have exactly the same, specificity score, it's going to pick the last selector and the style within its curly braces. Now, let me come back here, uncomment my inline style again, and override what I have in my CSS style sheet. Now, if it's important that you don't have access to the HTML document and you want to override the style, now you need to do this with caution. I repeat again, what I'm about to show you next, you have to use it with caution because once you use it, it's literally impossible to use normal selectors to override styles in your app or in your website again. So now that we have our style in our opening tag, the background color here is purple. If for whatever reason I want to override it, there is an instruction in your CSS called important. The moment you add it in front of a style, your browser would ignore or neglect every other instruction and use what we have. So for example, I have background color blue here, but my browser is not picking it up because my inline style, which already has a specificity score of 1000, is saying background color should be purple. What will I do to change it to blue at all costs? I would use the important keyword in CSS. And the moment I do that, what happens? It changes to blue. It ignores every other thing. It stops using the score that it normally would use to determine the style to pick. It will just pick that style that you have put because now you have said it is very important to you. Thank you so much for your time and have a blessed day.